Okay, so we're going to start this class on Ukashta Misham from there you shall seek. We're going to talk about what Rav Soloveitchik calls natural consciousness, a consciousness of creation. And what that explores is neatly summed up not by Rav Soloveitchik, by a different thinker who actually was in Berlin around the same time as Rav Soloveitchik, though I don't know to what degree they ever interacted. He's not in Berlin, he was in Germany, he was working in Frankfurt. When Rav Soloveitchik was in Berlin, Franz Rosenzweig was a German Jewish thinker. Right. And he has this idea that he's summed up sort of this fragment of a sentence of what it means that God created the world and is not just the God of revelation.
Franz Rosenzweig he wasn't religious.
Yeah? He was not Orthodox, but he was absolutely religious, and it gets into like how you define that question. He would certainly call himself religious, and I think most people would. He was very.
Follow halacha? Like live a halachic life?
In some form or another, absolutely. It's not clear, like always, how much and when. He certainly considered himself a Baal Tshuva and sort of in a process. So there's a famous story where someone asks him if he wears tefillin, and he says not yet, which is both saying no, but also saying maybe at some point. His theory of halacha is like the way to do in halacha and like live everyday life is really interesting, but it's for a totally different class.
What's his name?
Franz Rosenzweig. It's that first source on the page.
Can you buy, is this the type of thing you get on Amazon?
This one, no. This is like a random page from a diary entry. He has some stuff, but honestly, I don't recommend reading Franz Rosenzweig inside. He wrote terribly. He was just like really impossible to understand anything he wrote. I studied him for my master's. That's why I know about him. I wrote my master's thesis on Rav Soloveitchik's use of Franz Rosenzweig. But he's a very interesting thinker in a lot of ways. He makes there's lots of really good books about Franz Rosenzweig. Not that many good books by Franz Rosenzweig. But one of the broad themes in his thought is that you have to try and think together and like hold together the idea that God created the world and that God is also the God of revelation. That God gave us the Torah, but that isn't supposed to be somehow in contradiction to the world. That God is revealed and experienced both in the world, in creation, and in the Torah. That's why the Torah doesn't just start with Har Sinai or with the first mitzvah, right? The first Rashi on the Torah famously is like, why doesn't the Torah start with the first mitzvah? Because God is not just the God of mitzvot, God is also the God of creation. So Rav Soloveitchik's book, Ukashta Misham, takes that as its starting point. Essentially the idea that experiencing the world and living as a normal human being in the world
God's creation
is an experience of like the world, the way God made the world.
Does he also believe the Hasidic idea that God is constantly creating?
You mean he being Franz Rosenzweig or Rav Soloveitchik? Because it's a little confusing based on what you said.
Sorry.
I started with Franz Rosenzweig. We're going to be talking about Rav Soloveitchik. I'm using Rosenzweig as an introduction.
But Rav Soloveitchik believes in that?
Honestly, probably neither of them. Rav Soloveitchik could, but we're going to see here, like he's a little contradictory on some things, so he definitely could. The last text we're going to see today, if we get there, is about miracles, and so I don't think so. Meaning, like he is very, very.
Created the natural order, and then we.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're aware of what I'm talking about. I don't know what it's
Yeah.
called.
It doesn't have like a set name, but yeah, I know what you're talking about. So I was thinking we were going to do that in the medieval class. We're not, but there was also an idea that was around the medieval period.
Yeah.
Okay, source number 2 from this book, Rav Soloveitchik himself saying, the God of creation is the God of the hidden intellect, who created everything in his wisdom, without satisfying our curiosity and without explaining his acts, the creation. Right. So here he's trying to explain what is this idea of the God of creation. It's the God of the hidden intellect who created everything in his wisdom without satisfying our curiosity or explaining his acts. So satisfying our curiosity and explaining his acts is revelation, is God telling us, this is why I made the world the way it is, right? You're saying God didn't do that, but God did make the world in a way that's wise if you examine it. He doesn't believe you can prove that God exists from the world. He thinks you can have an experience of the world where you say, wow, there must be a creator. Wow, this is very well put together. And so from that idea of living in and experiencing the world, he develops this idea of natural consciousness, the next source. The meaning of natural consciousness is this. On the one hand, man's spirit soars to great distances. There's an aspiration rooted in our spiritual being to direct all the multiplicity in our limited temporal reality toward the first non-contingent existent, who acts within and beyond the world. Okay, let's do that quickly. An aspiration rooted in our spiritual being, and we have sort of spiritual nature as people, as human beings, to direct all the multiplicity in our limited temporal reality toward the first non-contingent existent, to see all of the different aspects of our lives, all the parts of the world we live in, as rooted in a creator who was not created, a non-contingent existent. He's riffing on the Rambam. Rambam begins the Hilchot Yesod HaTorah, the very beginning of Mishnah Torah, with saying, Yesod Yesodot Amud HaChachmot, the pillar of all wisdoms and the foundation of knowledge, foundation of all wisdoms and the pillar of knowledge, to know that there is Matzui Rishon, a first thing that exists, that is the basis of all existence. It is the only thing that has to exist, necessarily must exist. Everything else could exist or could not exist. Right? Like any specific rock could exist or could not exist, but like being, existence, God, these are things that like have to exist, otherwise, like God has to exist, otherwise nothing else makes sense. Though God doesn't make sense.
I don't like that.
It
doesn't make sense to me.
Alright, it's much longer, so let's not get into it. I mean, I think you're not wrong. It requires a very specific understanding of the relationship between language, knowledge, and reality. But
that's a larger discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so for who acts within and beyond the world. For Rav Soloveitchik's purposes, he's not concerned with like that way of thinking about God in the abstract, what Rambam is doing, or with proofs. He's talking about the fact that we have an urge, right? This is an aspiration rooted in our spiritual being to see reality as rooted in necessity. And see that like things, the way things are is the way for some reason they're supposed to be that way. There's something that grants them validity and something that affirms them. On the other hand, there's a universe impressed with the Creator's stamp, which offers a hint of a transcendent reality. We also sense there's something sort of beyond the world. In this framework, man's experience of the world is, in its essence and its purpose, the experience of God, the world's creator. The initiative must be human. Man must seek God. Right, so we have this twofold experience. One, that we sense that the world comes from somewhere. It has something that's sort of solid at its basis that makes it the way it is. And we sense also that there's more going on than just the world, something transcendent. And so for Rav Soloveitchik, that is like the kernel that we can expand on. He's going to talk about it, and we'll see next in culture. He calls culture like a very broad category of like science and probably art and stuff, things that can be places we look for that transcendent reality, that's something beyond. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay, so what I want to look at throughout the rest of this class is first a couple of brief passages where he talks about culture, and was expanding on this idea of experiencing God being the root of religious experience. We're going to talk next week about where he thinks it can't be all of religion, for a lot of different reasons he brings. There has to be an element of religion that comes from God rather than coming from man. But he just thinks the root of religion in some ways is that it comes from man. Then we're going to talk about...
He thinks the root of religion comes from man.
Yeah, we're talking about right now, right? That we have a fundamental need and aspiration to be religious, to find God, to find something more than this reality.
But that's not necessarily where religion comes from.
What? Well, I guess we have to define what we mean by religion here, right? So he would say that like religion as a broad human phenomena comes from within people. He's going to say that one of the reasons you need revelation is because you can't get to anything like Judaism, like halacha, or even we can't even really sufficiently get to a sort of purely human religion without something that comes from outside ourselves. But so like Judaism you might say it has two roots. It has a root in human thought and like human experience and urges and drives, and it also has it's rooted in God and revelation. And I think also, but they'll go back to like the two. Once we get to that point where we have both of them are mutually related. So the next part of the class, we're going to be jumping to his discussion of like he talks about berakhot. So berakhot are something that come from, in some sense, like the revelational aspect. That's part of halacha, right? but they become a framework for experiencing the world again, for returning to a natural consciousness through the lens of halacha. Yeah.
Rav Soloveitchik saying in the meaning of natural consciousness that like we naturally aspire towards a transcendent experience that does not exist in our world. Is that what he's?
No, because he's going to talk about the ability to find this in our world.
But like he. Sorry, I'm just confused by what he's saying.
No, absolutely.
So is he trying to prove the point of like we naturally want to we naturally aspire to reach closer to the infinite, which created our experience?
Yeah.
Is that what he's saying?
Yes.
Okay.
We have a natural drive to find something beyond this reality, but also to find it through this reality, right? And that you don't find God by denying the world you live in. We talked about this a bunch in Halachic Man, remember? He was very interested in this worldly holiness. Holiness is focused on life we live in this world, in nature, in community. And as we talk about here, it's about nature, but also culture.
Does he disagree with a lot of like famous Pacific masters? There are also just people who believe that this world is just an illusion and there's theoretically no importance to it.
That's the second part there is where he disagrees.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
He disagrees with the no importance part. And also even the illusion part. I mean, he talks about the idea of tzimtzum, of God's sort of divine contraction. And he talks about, in this book, references the Hasidic phrases mimale kol almin v'sovev kol almin, that God fills all worlds and surrounds all worlds. He says he says explicitly, like, the debate is up. God, everyone agrees, God is both immanent and transcendent. So on some level, the idea that this world is all wholly divine is something he explicitly affirms. But he doesn't think that makes it any less real. When he talks about tzimtzum in Halachic Man, he makes it very clear that he sees tzimtzum not as a withdrawal from the world, so much as a contraction into the world. That the God is in some sense validating the world and saying this world is like totally the way God wants it to be and affirmed. This is a great thing he does here. He says here's the question of whether the deity's connection with the world is transcendent or immanent is irrelevant. Man sometimes attempts to find God within reality and sometimes beyond it. It all depends on the viewpoint of the individual who searches. There are many facets to man's awareness of God, which is replete with the absolute and the eternal, yet reverberates within a contingent temporal creature. It listens for the occasional notes of the old new song that bursts forth from without as well as from within reality, attesting to a wondrous, supermundane being that, in the Kabbalist phrase, fills and surrounds all world. And in a fun thing, he must have been smiling to himself, he here sources both the Tanya and the Nefesh HaChaim for that phrase. Mystical masters justly taught that deity separates itself from the existent, which is imprinted with the stamp of creation, and chained by constraints of objective cosmic necessity, at the same time dwells within it as one who dwells with them in their impurity. The Shekhinah both imbues both object and subject, yet also transcends them. God created the world, his primordial will exists within it. Malchut is the name the Kabbalists gave to the Shekhinah, hidden with the lawfulness of nature and spirit, but God dwells beyond the limits of reality in infinite eternity. Right? He's, very ready to affirm both of them, but for him that doesn't mean denying reality and thinking like we should ignore the reality in the world and ourselves.
It's crazy. That's great.
I just love the fact that he sources both the Tanya and the Nefesh HaChaim because they were sort of famously opposed.
Yeah.
Like the Nefesh HaChaim's whole reason for existence as a book, it says explicitly is that like these secrets the Kabbalistic secrets are being taught badly. They're going to be taught by people who aren't doing it well. It's not ordered. Who are going to get confused, which is like talking about Chassidut in general, and probably about the Tanya itself. But the Tanya was the first book of systematic Chassidic teachings. It has a whole section on the Tanya, on the Tzimtzum.
Did Nefesh HaChaim think that Tanya was wrong?
No, they seem to agree. It's actually a huge academic debate and Mefarshim within the tradition as well. There's a 2-volume translation of the Nefesh HaChaim was put out a couple years ago called Nefesh HaTzimtzum. I think they kind of put together as Abraham Frankel. One second. So the Nefesh HaTzimtzum 2 volumes. The second volume is actually is just devoted to not to the Nefesh HaChaim anymore, but to a discussion of what the Nefesh HaChaim actually believe about Tzimtzum. What's the actual debate with the Hasidim about it? I think the simplest sense is it really revolves around the question of should we be trying to get outside our own consciousness or not. So for a lot of Chassidut, there's a goal of bitul, of attempting to nullify your own existence and to consciously be aware and experience the reality that this is false, that this is not real, that everything is God, and sort of experience that on a much more conscious level. The Nefesh HaChaim wants you to know that's true in the back of your mind and never think about it except maybe during Kriyat Shema. That's he says this phenomenal drush. This is he quotes a midrash from Chazal that says, "God is in the world like the soul is in the body." Right, that could mean all kinds of things. Like you could go all kinds of directions with that. He says the same way the soul is imperceptibly in the body. You can't tell you have a soul. You have a body, and because you know the soul is there, but it's not. There's no perceiving it. So too, God is imperceptibly in the world. You cannot perceive God in the world, and you're not supposed to.
Exactly. Like, why would God create this if we're not supposed to experience it like this?
It's a very good question.
A big problem I had with reading the Tanya is that it is like openly accepting this idea that this world is an illusion, fine. But also, because it's an illusion, there is no inherent importance to it, and we should try to transcend it.
Right. I don't think those necessarily follow one from the other.
Yeah.
You'd say.
Exactly.
Yeah. And even within Chassidut, I think it's not so clear that that was the main approach taken.
Especially now. I think it used to be.
Maybe a lot of Hasidic text could be read either way.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah. A really good example is anything from the Baal Shem Tov. You could read it either way. A lot of this. So Baal Shem Tov doesn't have any texts he wrote. One letter that's attributed to him. Otherwise, it's all quotations in the works of students. But most of those quotations, when they come to topics like this, could be read really either way. It's a very subtle difference between saying, I look at the world and I see God you say that phrase, right? I look at the world and I see God. Do you mean, I look at the world in its concrete manifestations and realize those concrete manifestations are God? Or do you say, I look at the world and I don't even see the world really. I see past the world and see God. That I deny the concrete manifestations, and that's what I'm seeing. And you could read both of those into the phrase, I look at the world and I see God. A lot of them are those sort of, because they're short and not fully spelled out, a lot of those sort of statements. Okay, let's get back to the source sheet, culture section, source number 4. There is no hidden corner of the natural or spiritual world which man's consciousness, pining for its divine beloved, does not peer into and scrutinize, where we explore everything. Human consciousness carefully investigates the buds of transcendence that appear every so often in the spiritual desert. The search is not the romantic yearning of fugitives from the monotonous secularism of the everyday, right? We don't search for transcendence, right? He's gonna speak in very broad terms right now that are in some ways foreign to Jewish experience, right? We talk in Judaism, we tend to talk about Hashem or God, all sorts of Jewish words, but because he's talking here more about the human phenomenon of religion, before you get to the idea of Judaism specifically, using much broader terms like transcendence. Rather, it is rooted in general cultural consciousness. Cultural consciousness is, on some level, a search for transcendence. Flesh and blood man longs to escape from the straits of the limited, bounded, and contingent world and go out into the limitless, independent, wide-open spaces. This search is an act of self-transcendence, which is truly the essence of man's cultural ascent. For Rav Soloveitchik, on some level, all culture, and he's talking about everything from literature to science, is an attempt to find something more than who we are, to get outside ourselves and discover something incredible. He has other texts, no question, where he's very critical of we call it aesthetics or some forms of art, because he thinks that they tend to celebrate the self too much. But as long as what you're looking for is trying to find something more than the human, so you find transcendence, then he's much more supportive of it.
But Rav Soloveitchik was pretty. We don't have to have this discussion now, but Rav Soloveitchik was pretty out front about I don't support. I think art is bad. I think aesthetics is bad. Even if he says separately, it's important to look for something bigger than yourself outside of this world, then why does he make the blatant statement of he wasn't alive when it was just a Christian thing to do art and it was just a purely aesthetic. He was alive in the 60s. he saw art that was already past the Renaissance period, already like meaningful, past Impressionism. It had meaning to it, that depth.
So one, arguably, he might say the reverse, that like, right, it used to have depth and now it doesn't. There were plenty of people throughout the 20th century who said that.
No, but I'm saying, okay.
No, I think he also could say there's a variety of different things to art. I mean,
When did it used to have depth?
What?
In that opinion, when did it used to have depth?
I mean, it depends who you're talking to. They'll say like up until the 1800s. But I mean, most people who say that, I mean, like right until they started making art that I don't like, it used to have depth. I don't know, like since the end of the 1800s, people have been complaining about modern art, roughly.
Modern art is fairly, but like, it doesn't have much.
Different discussion. Like you're. I don't know. There's stuff on both sides that discussion to require.
Rav Soloveitchik was pretty like outspoken on the idea that there's nothing for people there. He says that you have been unconfronted by God if you like art.
See, I just don't think that's a good read of that piece of Rav Soloveitchik. I'm assuming I'm thinking of the same thing you're thinking of, which is in confrontation.
Yeah.
Then, so, like he says explicitly, he's much, in many ways, even more critical in the Worship of the Heart, his book on Tefillah, where he goes in depth about the aesthetics at length in his discussion of Tefillah. And part of there, he does come back to like the restoration of aesthetics as being important, but in both of them, the problem with the problem of art and aesthetics for Soloveitchik is that it fundamentally remains an act of self-assertion, of being unconfronted, right? Of just, you're going to express whatever you're feeling inside and bring it out. And on some level, that's already a very specific vision of art, which is very modern, very romantic understanding of art, as the artist taking something inside themselves and recreating it, right? Even throughout all the different impressionist and cubist and like weird early modern versions of art, they're still actually trying to recreate something they see outside themselves. It's only in the modern period that art is no longer about creating representations of things in the world, and it becomes about like just expressing yourself.
But I think even impressionists would tell you that that's not what they're doing art for.
Okay, I don't want to get. We're already more into this tangent than we should be. I don't want to get into art history too. But I think once Rav Soloveitchik says his main critique of what time it is. Okay, well, main critique of art is to be due to it's like obsessed with the self and doesn't recognize law and things outside of your own understanding, which are his double sort of confrontations, confronting your own human ability to make laws and then confronting God. And sort of the particularism of divine revelation, then like once you have those, you could come back to art that recognizes those things, right? You could have art that recognizes it recognizes cultural particularity, ethics, rules, all these things that he thinks just aren't in art, and just like they would absolutely be fine by his standards, near as I can tell. Okay. Second paragraph in source number 4. Seeking God through the external and internal worlds is not a theological issue of interest only to scholars of religion. It is a fundamental problem that arose at the dawn of human culture. From the time of the Greek philosophers to that of the masters of modern philosophy, not to mention the sages of theocentric Eastern cultures, the search for God has resounded throughout the intellectual world. It takes different forms in accordance with the historical and cultural peculiarities of each epoch, each era. It conceals and disguises itself in the range of concepts and variegated aspects through which each generation expresses its thoughts and internal struggles, but it never disappears entirely from the horizon of inquiry. So we're talking about like a broad human concept of God, of transcendence. So it looks a little different in each generation, right? The Greeks, even the Greek philosophers looking for God, don't arrive at biblical monotheism or Kabbalistic panentheism, certainly not Chassidut. But there's distinct similarities between Chassidut and a lot of modern religions in terms of the emphasis on inner experience of God and a relationship with God. So each sort of cultural and historical epoch take different. The search for God takes different forms, but it remains a broadly human phenomenon. Even mathematicians do not deny this fact. The divine mystery remains in place even in the field of scientific knowledge. Whenever it transcends the limits of precise physical experimentation and enters the realm of philosophical or metaphysical thought. Science, indeed, admits that it cannot explain a spatio-temporal phenomenon by a transcendental idea. For it cannot transcend its own limits and escape the circle of categorical assumptions about corresponding to critical scientific experience.
Does he sing?
So I can finish the last line here, and then we'll go back to that. Which is limited to the domain of finite perception and thought. Science does, however, admit to the presence of an irrational element in any worldview and does not deny the right of others to investigate it. Right? Just that science itself understands that there is interested in, to some degree, there's an element that transcends it, that transcends scientific experience. It cannot explain a spatio-temporal phenomenon by a transcendental idea. That science, he has a very specific understanding of science that not necessarily everyone would agree with, but science is an attempt to create an idea, a sort of mental model, a philosophical model of the world, that by abstracting from the phenomena and figuring what are the laws, right? What are the natural laws that govern the universe, and you arrive at those via experimentation and things. And so science, he says, recognizes there's a difference between those two things. There's a difference between the world, right? The raw matter of the world and it's our own ability to understand it. So science recognizes it's something transcendent, something irrational that it can never really fully encompass.
Right. Even in the Big Bang, they believe that there's a substance called matter X.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way of denoting the thing we don't understand.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you could get into even more than that, because the Big Bang is fundamentally part of broad attempts to explain the universe in a wholly unified fashion, right? Sort of trying to arrive at a systemic theory of everything, and you just, anyone who's talking to them recognize, okay, there are things we don't understand. This will always remain sort of an aspiration. It would be nice to be able to explain everything, but we can't.
But also the same thing with Judaism.
Yeah.
It's not.
No, I mean, this is a. So that's part of how we're going to arrive at revelation for Rav Soloveitchik. With this video next week, he thinks if you're trying to get at God, you're going to have to get outside human experience somehow, and you can't do that. You need revelation to do that. Science, in a sense, God has to come to you. What you can do.
But we can see God through creation.
Yeah, we can seek God through creation, and that seeking is important. But all you'll ever find is creation, right? You'll find the wisdom in creation and the wondrousness of creation.
Depending on how you perceive creation or define creation, then you could say that you found God.
Right, so what you can say is you found something beyond creation, but part of it is you don't know what words to use for that. Imagine there were no revelation. All you say is there's this transcendent thing. But that's part of what Rav Soloveitchik is trying to get at with using the transcendental idea, the irrational. Right? When you see God through the world, through human experience, you can get at something there's something outside ourselves, but you don't know what words to use to describe it. So each cultural and historical epoch has its own language for talking about that sort of thing. And part of that's also every religious tradition has its language for doing that sort of thing. It's a broad debate amongst people who study mystical experiences. Do they all experiencing the same thing? Is there some sort of people, whether they're some level of religious and believers in mysticism, they believe they're experiencing something transcendent. Are they all experiencing the same thing, or are they all having the same sort of basic human experience if they're not believers of it? But what's the relationship between the language mystics put their experiences into versus the experience itself, right? So the Zohar is full of mystical experiences, some of which are described in Jewish language, some of which are described in totally unique language that wouldn't be Jewish except that it's from the Zohar, and the Zohar is a Jewish book. It's not language from the rest of the Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
It's a chiddush within the Jewish tradition, and that's part of the question. It's all of those things take place within our own tradition and give us language for talking about the transcendent, the things that are escape us when we seek God in this world. Yeah. Any questions so far? Okay. We've got at least one more text, but we are running short on time. No. If there was an actual discussion that was important to stop, I would stop it. But there's a good discussion to have, and it's relatively on topic. Plus, the last couple things can be summed up pretty easily without getting into them. From this viewpoint, this is number 5, man's ontological experience manifests itself in 2 aspects. As scientific experience, which is relative, limited, and contingent, producing an ideal functional correlative that corresponds to the unexplained alien being. Right? You experience 2 different, man's ontological experience, man's experience of reality on its deepest level, has 2 aspects. One as scientific, relative, which is limited, and as transcendental experience. An experience of the absolute infinite within the temporal, bounded, and contingent. Right? So there's experience of the world which we can explore and know, and we can understand there's something there that's more than we really are able to see, and then also the attempt to experience that more via the limited. An encounter with the Creator within the creation as its origin and end. The first type of experience is formulated in symbolic mathematical equations, the second in continuous yearning and wondrous immediate experience, which burst forth from the depths of human experience and sweep the individual to mysterious faraway realms. There is religious facticity just as there is scientific facticity, right? You can have a religious experience, and for the person who has that experience, it's a fact, just as much as science is a fact. It's personal and subjective, and you can't necessarily communicate it to other people, but it is, for you, it's just as real as everything else, and we can recognize that, like, people have that experience. People have, not everyone, but lots of people have that experience, something that's very real to them, even though it's not, like, obvious to the rest of us. Yeah?
So isn't science subjective in a way?
In what way? Meaning, like, you're not necessarily wrong, but subjective and objective are complex terms used differently by everyone. So, like, let's just throw it out there. When Rav Soloveitchik uses subjective, what he means is it happens to the individual in ways that are not necessarily communicable to everyone else. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not real. It might be real, it might not. But it's something that happens within you, and it's not available to everyone else. So he's in this book, in Halachic Man, he's deeply worried about subjectivity staying just subjective, and staying just within the realm of the purely individual. And emotions are one of those things. Within the realm of purely individual, he says you can't, and nothing can stay that way. You have to somehow concretize it into whether it's actions or words, something that you can share with other people and discuss with them. And in both this, like V'kashta Misham and in Halachic Man, he attributes the Holocaust to subjectivity run amok. At the very least, he says people who believe in pure subjectivity, at the very least, let it happen. He's going to attack Christians in this book. He says all those who spoke of love stood by and did nothing. That people who profess that religion is all about your inner experience, let the Holocaust happen. But for him, something to be objective means that it's publicly available. Everyone can know it, everyone can see it, talk about it, and share it. So halacha is something that, if not everyone, but the entirety of the Jewish community shares, right? It's put down in texts, we can all talk about it, we can all, to our own specific degrees, partake in it. So that's very important to him. And what this book is really about in some ways is how do we go from purely subjective experiences of God, which is what we're talking about right now, right? We talked about last week, proof. Proof is objective because you can put it into words that are compelling to everyone. And if you think that doesn't work anymore when it comes to talking about God, all you have is experience, then you've really retreated from the objective realm to the subjective realm. So what we're going to be trying to deal with for Rav Soloveitchik, one of his problems with religious experience as the basis of religion is that it's purely subjective. And that always leaves you stuck within the individual. There's no communal life there. There's no way of knowing if you've really succeeded in getting outside yourself.
So is that part of Lonely Man of Faith?
Lonely Man of Faith is actually a pivot back in the other direction. Lonely Man of Faith is much more interested in subjectivity.
No, but that's what I'm saying. I'm saying his acknowledgement of this world being basically made on the grounds of subjectivity. You can experience true objectivity in this world.
Yeah, but so what do you mean by objectivity? Because what he's not saying when we talk about objectivity is the empirical truth about the world, right? We in
justice.
What? What do you mean? Justice is a social term, right? Justice is some feature of society.
Sure.
But he's saying that the closer he comes to talking about objectivity, he talks about the irrational element in science. That's talking about the world. What Germans call das Ding an sich, the thing in itself. right? Like the real thing of Rav Soloveitchik, we have experiences of that sort of that reflect that in sort of subjective experiences of it, of the way things feel, of the like the different colors, temperatures, all the sense experience, and we can like quantify certain things, sort of size, placement, like more objective things. But we don't get to the thing itself, and he like your science is aware of that. But like when he talks about like we're going to see next class, with Revelation provides us with objective rules, right? Halacha is objective rules. Mitzvot are objective rules. He doesn't mean it's telling us some truth about the world, right? People think about science as objective, and it tells us truths about the world. That's not what Rav Soloveitchik means. He's not telling us to think truth about the world, but things that are publicly available and shared by all people, or by all Jews at the very least. We're in the middle of this paragraph number 5. The line that starts scientific facticity. There is religious reality just as there's scientific reality. These refer to experiencing the world as aspiring toward God, as a living, bubbly, effervescent consciousness burning with the flame of pent-up longing, which cannot be overcome by symbolic relative logic, right? So he says that there's an experience of the world as having more going on in it. It's not just being raw matter, as being somehow like almost energetic. Then in ways that science can't quantify. The scientific as well as the sensual, qualitative perception of the world, the consciousness of the self as well as the lofty aesthetic experience, all these can turn into great sublime enduring transcendental experience, an experience of the Creator, right? So we can experience God through our experience of the world, both in terms of like the majesty of waterfalls and mountains and things, but also of like there's just so much going on in the world. There's like the fact that things exist gets can't be summed up scientifically. So for Ethan, for you, this is heading in the direction of Heschel's radical amazement. The very existence of the conditioned testifies to the existence of the one setting the conditions. This is not a complicated logical proof, it is a most certain vision of felt experience. Right? The fact that there is existence ought to make us feel for us that there is someone who made it exist, certainly made it exist the way it is. The cultural consciousness peers into an opaque, disjunctive realm which is not its own, and chases after the reflection of the God who oversees everything from the crannies of relative being. It falls in love with the appearance of the handsome lover and follows him. Right, so that's sort of where we're going to end up with this source sheet. I want to continue it next week. I want to move on to the rest of the book. So we'll sum up quickly the rest of the book, which is the source sheet. Sorry, which is that the next couple texts, if you guys want to look at them, if not, talks about the way berakhot are in some sense Judaism's version of this transcendental experience. Once we already have revelational experience, once we already have halacha and a framework for talking about the transcendental, halacha returns us to the world via berakhot. Berakhot are moments of appreciating this world. In fact, Rav Soloveitchik wants to claim, I think there's definitely something to this idea that comes from the Kuzari, that actually taking time to meditate on the world, on food, on whatever it is, when you make a bracha, actually increases your awareness of your enjoyment of it, of how wonderful, like how much is going on there. That sort of divinity to it. Is that there's actually sort of more enjoyment in food than, or at least as much than when someone who's not religious enjoys it. That halacha is sort of meant to return us to the world in that way, and the way it does that is berakhot. The last thing I have a note here on miracles from later in the book, and then what are part of the ramifications of this view of creation, of natural consciousness, is that miracles aren't a great thing, right? If God made the world the way it is, then you should be finding God through the world and its natural order, rather than through the shattering of that natural order, right? So he says that the here and in what we'll call Emergence of Ethical Man, was on like Bereshit and Shemot, mostly Bereshit. He talks about the idea that miracles, what makes miracles matter is when they happen. That's what's significant. That things happen, but it's not that they shattered nature. What matters in miracles is that it happened at the right time for God's goal to be achieved, but it would be a totally natural occurrence. So he's like on board with the claims that like the 10 plagues were totally natural. They all happened at once and at the right time to enable the historical transition of the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt. Because for him, God created the world, and that matters. Like the idea that God is revealed through the shattering of nature rather than through exploring nature is because people talk about God as somehow separate from the world. But for Rosevich, he's not interested. He's like, no, God made the world. God is not opposed to it. Any questions? No? Okay, next week we'll move into revelational consciousness. Thank you guys. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.